How did Grandpa enter the Army? How did he enter the Army?
Well, he was drafted, and they had to go to Indianapolis. I think that's where they got their physicals and everything, and I don't know whether he left right from Indianapolis. I have no idea. See, all of this was before I knew him, so I can't really help you much there.
Did he ever explain the draft process or talk about any issues?
No, he didn't. He never mentioned what they had to do. He never mentioned anything about the physical or no. But like I say, I didn't know him before, and he probably talked about it more to the kids while I was at work. But I don't know any of the details.
How did Grandpa enter the Army?
Not voluntarily, he was drafted.
How did Grandpa enter the Army?
Well, he was drafted, and I do remember he mentioned one time that the draft letter said, "Your friends and neighbors have selected you to represent them." And he always just shook his head and thought he didn't have any friends and neighbors who would do that to him. But yeah, he was drafted.
Did he ever explain the draft process?
No. And I think he was notified, I don't know if he's notified by mail or they used to publish the numbers in the paper.
Did he ever explain the draft process?
No, he really didn't, and I don't remember him talking much about it other than the draft letter itself. So I think it was maybe a lottery process, but he didn't really talk about that. I mean, he had to sign up for it, and I presume the draft board just selected names sort of at random.
What do you know about his training and trip overseas, to Japan and everything?
I know he took his physical in Indianapolis and then his training was in California. And the trip overseas by boat, but they were all sick all the way over. They had food poisoning plus motion sickness. So when they arrived in Japan, they were all pretty weak.
What do you know about his training?
Well, he didn't talk too much, actually, he didn't talk much about the war at all. But one of the stories, and I didn't hear this until he was much older, and I was probably a teenager, early 20s. But this was during boot camp, probably basic training. It was probably in California right after he entered after being drafted. And I don't remember what he did, but he was being disciplined. And his sergeant, or maybe it was a lieutenant, but I think it was a sergeant, made him dig a hole with a spoon, and it was probably something like, I don't remember the exact dimensions, but like 2 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet deep, something like that. So and it was actually raining. It was outside in the rain. He had to dig this hole with a spoon. And his sergeant had him take the newspaper, fold it up, put it in the bottom of the hole, and bury it with the spoon. Well, that wasn't good enough. So his sergeant asked him what the headline was, and Dad didn't know. So the sergeant had him dig the hole back up, read the headline off the newspaper, fold it back up, and bury it again with the spoon. So that was one little story from basic training. And there's one other story, and I think this was probably during basic training also, because they were building endurance, going on hikes with packs. And Dad, he was, whenever he would get worked up or tired doing anything, his face would turn really red, and he knew this. Well, one time on this hike, one of these hikes, his face started turning really red. And his sergeant or his lieutenant, again I don't remember, said, "Brown," and he would hold up like 2 fingers. "How many fingers am I holding up?" Dad knew his face was red. Dad didn't answer. So the implication or the assumption was maybe nearing heat exhaustion. So he was sent to the infirmary. And he was perfectly fine. He just knew his face was red. He looked really in bad shape. And he just didn't answer how many fingers were held up. So he got sent back to the infirmary where it was a little cooler. He could drink some water and he avoided the hike. So those are a couple of stories I do know about the training. The training itself I don't know, but those stories I did hear.
He was heavier when he went in, but it didn't take long to lose that weight because of all the marches they had to do, and I can't tell you how many pounds of pack they had to carry. But anybody that went in heavy lost weight, and anybody that was thin gained weight. They just that was something they did then. And whatever they had to eat on a special day one year, they had the same exact thing the following year. Their menus were the same.
So did he gain weight when he entered?
He lost weight.
Okay.
He said he was heavy before, but the only thing I've got is pictures of when he was little. And he didn't look like he was heavy then, but he did lose weight.
What do you know about his training and the trip overseas?
Only that he got sick, seasick. I don't know anything about how he came back, but I imagine it was by ship. Now, I don't know. They might have flown him back. And then I think he might have hitchhiked home. But I do know the Red Cross got on him over there because his dad contacted the Red Cross because they hadn't heard from him. So the Red Cross told Dick to start writing to his parents. I don't know if he did or not.
What do you know about his trip overseas to Korea?
I don't know what year it was, but it seems to me this is one of the things he talked about on the troop transport on the way over. And the bunks they had, the berth, the compartment that they were bunked in, I think the bunks were stacked 3 high. And on the trip over, I think he was in the bow of the ship, so it was toward the front end of the ship. Well, part of the trip, I don't know if they went through the typhoon or just traveled near it, but went through some very heavy seas to the point where the bow would come up out of the waves and then it would settle the other direction, and then the screw, the propeller, would come out of the waves above the water. And every time it did that, with the propeller still turning, it would vibrate and shake the entire ship. Every time the stern would come up, it would shake the ship. Well, everyone on board got seasick. And one time he heard all kinds of commotion or something happening, maybe heard someone getting sick in the compartment. He was in the middle tier, the middle bunk, so one guy below him, one guy above him. And he heard someone getting sick. He woke up, rolled over, leaned out, stuck his head out to see what was going on below him. The guy above him did the same thing, but he'd gotten sick, right on the back of Dad's head. And that just instantly made Dad get sick as well. So he just joined right in, as he said. But it was a rough trip. Everyone was seasick, especially the ones on that end of the ship, because being in the bow, you're also a tremendous amount of elevation change. You might go 20 feet above the water, 20 feet below the waves continually. And it was a rough trip.
Did he ever mention conflicts or military action in Korea?
The only thing that I recall of him mentioning, he just never really talked that much about it. But his class ring, I think Julie told you about that. He was shaving or something and he took his class ring off. And somebody came in and said the chinks were coming, so they had to bug out right away, and he lost his class ring then.
Did he ever mention anything about his time in Korea?
He liked the guys, but he had three major problems. One time he was assigned to take a general from one camp to another. By then he'd been promoted to corporal. But they were given a Jeep that had bad transmission. It could go forwards, backwards, but only turn one direction. So in the process of taking him, they'd have to turn the other direction. Well, the only way to do that was go forward, backward, turn the right way. Then forward, backward, and turn to the right, if they wanted to make a left. By the time they got there, the general was so upset, he busted Dad from corporal back to private. But another time, it was four guys in a Jeep. Again, bad transmission. It could only go forward. It couldn't go backwards or to the side. So they get to a corner, they'd all have to climb out, strip it down, pick it up, turn it, put everything back in, get in, and go as far as they could. And then if they had to make another turn, okay, strip it down, pick it up, turn it. And that's the only way they could get anywhere. And the third time, he'd been up for about 8 days. His commanding officer wanted to know how long, he knowed he'd been going strong. He said what day he'd last slept. So that was 8 days ago. Go to bed. So he crawled in the back of a Jeep. Meanwhile, they got the orders to bug out again. They couldn't wake him up. So they took him and the seat he was on out of the Jeep, used the Jeep to move equipment around. When they got ready to leave, they picked him and the seat up, put it back in the Jeep, and took off. He woke up 24 hours later in a different camp. But he never did wake up during that 24 hours. And we're talking about a war zone, so there wasn't any really drinkable water. What water they had was used for cooking. But each soldier was given 2 beers a day.
They kept them in the river, didn't they?
Yeah, they kept him cool in the river. And he really didn't like beer. But he had to learn to drink it because that's all he got to drink. 2 a day. After the Army, maybe 1 or 2 a year. He'd had it with the beer.
Well, maybe that's what he told you, but he drank more than that.
But being in the Corps of Engineers, they're the ones that had to go ahead of the troops or behind the troops. And several times when they bugged out, they were actually behind enemy lines, trying to blow up bridges or whatever, and then get out fast before the enemy could retreat or move much forward. And one of those times he was in the process of washing up, and that's when he lost his class ring. Because they got the order to bug out. He didn't have time to even wash the soap off his face. He just had to grab what he could and take off.
Did he ever mention military conflicts or action in Korea?
Well, he was in the combat engineers, so they didn't see combat directly. Some of the things they did would be building pontoon bridges across rivers, or sometimes if they had demolitions, they might be blowing up bridges. But his unit would quite often build the pontoon bridges, and it was interesting how they would make them. They would build the pontoons right on the shore, both directions, across the water and inshore, to maintain balance until it was long enough to span the river, and then the part they built on land to balance it, then they would dismantle it once it spanned the river. Now, he could hear some action, essentially, because there was one time when they were camped on one side of the road, there was a battery of 155 millimeter howitzers on the other side of the road, and they would be firing, sometimes day and night. So that would make it almost impossible to sleep at night. But you just hear them fire every once in a while, periodically, just right across. And it was, again, not a good situation to be in. One other story he mentioned, their camp had come under fire from a sniper. And I don't know if they were told how to sleep or not, but one of the guys he knew was sleeping on his stomach kind of as you would with your toes down and your heels sticking up, and a sniper fired and actually came through the tent, and I don't remember if it took off one or both of this guy's heels. It was just low enough. It didn't kill him, but it literally shot off his heels. So again, that's not necessarily frontline combat, but it's pretty close.
What was his return trip like, and his return to the U.S.?
Well, I know he came back on boat, and again, all the guys were seasick, and they landed somewhere in California. And of course, they didn't provide transportation home. I mean, they would get you out to California to serve, but once you were done, they were done with you. So you had to find your own way home. And he hitchhiked. But he did say being in the Army turned him into a man. Before he was a boy, now he was a man.
No, but he never talked a whole lot about it to me. And his uniform, he had dyed green because he... Oh, I was supposed to leave that open, wasn't I? Oh, I tell you, Clayton, I'm there back there again.
He never talked about losing anybody in the war. If he did, it was only with his brothers because they had also served. So they had similar experiences. They could understand each other, where there's no way we could even visualize what he'd gone through.
What are some unique personal stories about the war?
Well, he did talk one time about going along one of the roads in South Korea, and this was in wintertime. Must have been in the mountains too, because there's a lot of mountainous terrain there. And when they were driving along, he just noticed and made a comment about the shrubs that he saw sticking above the snow along the side of the road. Well, his buddy in the truck with him mentioned, oh, by the way, those aren't shrubs, those are the tops of trees. He didn't know how deep the snow was, but that gives you an idea that in that part of Korea, the winters could be pretty harsh and a lot of very deep snow. One other time, and this was much later, obviously in his life, watching the TV show MASH, because we always watched that quite a bit, but he just made the comment one time that in a lot of ways the show wasn't realistic, which is not surprising. But he pointed out, because he saw the MASH units actually in Korea. And unlike the TV show, they never used their tents. They had tents. If they had to bug out or evacuate, the hospital could set up in tents. But normally they never operated that way. They would use homes or sheds or barns or whatever was already there and set up operation in those structures. But they'd have the tents with them if they had to evacuate and set up temporarily someplace else.
What was his trip home and his return to the U.S. like?
Well, the trip home, fortunately, was a little smoother than the trip over. Again, of course, it was a troop transport. Now, again, they did sail either near or through a typhoon like they did before, but this time he was fortunate. His berth, his compartment was midships. So instead of the dramatic motion in the bow on the trip over, this time it was just right midship, so you'd have a rocking motion. So it was much more stable. He didn't get seasick that time. So that was a much better trip. And I do believe he came back in through San Francisco is where they came back.
How did he react to news about Vietnam?
I don't think we discussed it. I don't think we discussed it. The only thing myself, I said that if Jim was old enough for the draft, of course I still had the draft then, I'd take him to Canada. That's the way I felt about it. But I don't know how Dick felt about it. It was a very, very bad war. And Korea was a war. Why they called that a peace action, I have no idea. A war is a war. But what do I know?
How did he react to Vietnam and other U.S. wars?
I don't remember really so much him reacting to the others. Mom did. I remember one time there was some kind of a battle or civil war going on around Cambodia, maybe Thailand at the time, and she was concerned that we'd start up a draft and start getting back into war all again. But I don't remember Dad really making a comment like that. Now, unrelated to the Korean War, I do remember him explaining one time, and I remember seeing this gentleman in the news, probably late 70s, in Israel. Moshe Dayan, I believe was his name. And he was, I don't know if he was their Ministry of Defense or Minister of Defense at the time. He had a patch over one eye. But Dad was explaining that he was the one of the commanding generals of the Israeli Defense Forces during the Six-Day War, and it was some of his strategy that allowed Israel to successfully defend themselves after they were attacked by all of their surrounding Arab neighbors. So Moshe Dayan was instrumental in that. So I remember Dad just making that comment one time.
Did he ever mention the reunions to you?
He would talk about him a little bit. He hadn't gone to him for a long, long time, but they contacted him. One of his buddies from the unit contacted him and invited him. So he and Mom did go out to Las Vegas, I think it was. And I don't remember if it was once or twice that they'd gone out. But of course, they hadn't seen or talked to one another since they all left Korea. But they had a great time just visiting. And again, they didn't talk about what they saw, they talked about the people and the guys that didn't make it, and comparing notes on kind of just catching up on life, how each one had gone through life since then, and just had a great time visiting and renewing acquaintances and old friendships.
Okay. Pierce, yeah. That Billy Pierce, he's the one that I don't know whether put what you want, but Dick and I had 2 old bikes, and he had gone for a bike ride, and Julie took the call. It was this Billy Pierce, and he wanted to talk to Dad. So I got on my bike, and I found him, and got him back here, and then Billy called later, and he was one of his best friends in Korea. And he had never been able to go to one of the reunions before, but this one was close enough that they could drive. Because at that time, evidently, you couldn't take oxygen on planes. I don't know. But Dick didn't really, he thought it was kind of expensive, and he really wasn't interested in going all that much, but we did, and he did. He had a great time, and I'm so glad we got to go. And they sit around the table with their pictures that they had taken, trying to identify them by name. And they got some of them. Well, here it shows them looking at Billy Pierce's pictures right there. But it was just a nice, clean reunion. Now, there might have been drinking or brawling someplace else, but in this convention room, it was just all buddy-buddy. You know, they could remember their friends. But this letter is from his wife after Bill passed away, and after Dick passed away. But Bill thought a lot of him and mentioned some of their good times together. I was glad that they got to see each other at the convention in Las Vegas. It meant a lot to Bill. So I think they probably all kind of hesitated on going, but they were all glad that they did go. And it refreshed a lot of their memories. But I didn't hear any war stories or anything like that. And then the last morning we were there, this Billy Pierce, he bought breakfast for the 6 of us. It was a great trip. And really like I say, I didn't know him until he got out of the Army. And then I chased him till he caught me. I can't really help you any more than that, Jim, or Clayton.
Just some other things. I do remember him saying one time that he didn't care for rice when he was, I don't know if this was in Korea or Japan or both, but he said he'd had enough rice for his lifetime because quite often that's all he had over there, or not much was served. So after the war, he never had a desire to eat rice ever again. And if I can remember, I don't think we ever had rice at home growing up, and I think that was the reason. One other thing he did mention, by the time he was stationed in Korea, and this would have been after the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter, and that occurred when the North Koreans successfully crossed into South Korea and almost completely defeated South Korea, and we had a small force there helping them defend themselves, and compressed down to essentially the outskirts of the port city of Pusan. Now he knew guys who were there, but he was not there, fortunately, because he heard true horror stories of what was happening there. But that's when General MacArthur, I think, had a beach landing north, maybe at Incheon, north of Pusan, and essentially cut across the peninsula and cutting off the North Korean army at that time, kind of rescuing the Pusan port city. At that time, the Americans, U.S., UN forces, essentially pushed North Korea all the way back to its northern border, but that's when the Chinese also then crossed the border, and they eventually fought to the demilitarization zone as it stands today. And one thing that quite often isn't known well, the Korean War, the Korean conflict never ended. There was never a peace treaty ever signed. Peace was never declared. It's only been a ceasefire since, 1950, well, mid-50s. It's only been a ceasefire. Peace was never declared in that conflict to this very day.
When they first got to Japan, one of the things that they had to do was help clean up from the radioactive fallout from Hiroshima. By then, most of the radiation was gone, but there's still some contamination. But that was part of their training, was in the cleanup.
Oh, I could read this. I think he may have been in Japan more than he was in Korea. Because this picture was taken after he'd been driving around Japan for 4 months. But I really don't know. You just have to guess at it, I guess.
One other thing Dad said, and his kind of commentary on the draft system, I guess. He just made the comment that your average drafted soldier he thought was more reliable and maybe better trained than the regular army at that time. And in thinking about its hindsight, I guess, of course, after World War II, most of the army had been disbanded, most of the equipment had been retired. So apparently, seemingly, the training wasn't kept up either. So he just felt the draftees were made for a better soldier than the regular army.
He also said he wouldn't give anything for the experience, but they would play, and I won't mention the word, of getting him back in. Okay, I did remember that.
There's one story that hasn't gotten mentioned yet, and I don't remember who told me this, but I remember several times hearing this story. When Grandpa was over in Korea, because he was Army Corps of Engineers, he temporarily worked at a motor pool with all the different vehicles. And I think it was winter, but during that season in Korea, it was extremely cold. And everyone was bitterly cold, frostbite, things like that. Because he always had to go ahead and start the different trucks as part of his job, I remember hearing the story that he would crawl up right next to the engine compartment in the different vehicles to stay warm while they were running. And in doing so, he ended up smelling like gas and fumes and things like that. But of course, everyone stunk really badly, so that wasn't an issue.
He said he never regretted paying taxes over here because they didn't over there. And they had very, very little. And as far as restroom facilities are concerned, everything was along the road in the ditches. So he learned to be really appreciative of this country because of that.